Today's agenda. What we're going through now is introduction, workshop logistics, overview, and purpose of the workshop. My name is Donald Brooks. I am program and project supervisor for the Energy Resource Modeling team. We'll move through inputs and methods, covering data assumptions, definitions, and background, the Elcc study steps. I'm going to present with help from Kevin Carden at Elcc Consulting. There'll be a 20-minute presentation, maybe 10 minutes of Q&A. Then we'll move into the base portfolio level results and Prm calculation. I'll be presenting that. Again, 20 minutes presentation and a 10-minute Q&A. If parties feel the need to have a break, we have time here for a break at 2:15. Then at 2:30, we'll go on with technology-specific Elcc results, alternate portfolios, with results from the base portfolio and alternate portfolios. We'll do the PRM and Elcc conclusions. That'll be, again, shared between Kevin and I. Then we'll finish with the questions for stakeholders. We'll have 10 minutes to walk through the questions, and then about 35 minutes for parties to discuss what they think and maybe prepare some of their thoughts for comments and reply comments. And then we'll just wrap up the next steps, expecting to end at 4 p.m. today. Workshop logistics. Of course, it's online only. There's the link, the WebEx link. The workshop is being recorded. I think I put the right toll-free number there. If you're on the WebEx now, obviously you got it. The hosts are Energy Division staff, which are me, Patrick Young, Jamie Gannon, and as I mentioned, Kevin Carden is going to be helping us get through some of the material. Workshop logistics. Please submit questions for speakers in the chat box or raise your hand to be unmuted by staff. The questions will be read aloud by staff. Remember to mute yourself after asking the question. Those are the buttons, and that's what they do. Discussion logistics. The workshop is structured to stimulate an honest dialogue and engage different perspectives. Please be friendly and respectful. The chat feature is only for Q&A or technical issues. Do not start or respond to sidebar conversations. The event is held by WebEx events, via WebEx events, where everyone is muted at the beginning. To speak during the Q&A times, please send your questions to the moderator via the chat feature. And of course, please state your name and your organization before speaking. The outline of today, we have an overview and purpose of the workshop. We have inputs and methods. We have base portfolio level results and PRM calculation. We have technology-specific Elcc results and the alternate portfolios. And then we have conclusion and the questions for stakeholders. The purpose of the workshop today is to present PUC staff's assumptions, methods, and results for our studies. We calculated a monthly planning reserve margin consistent with achieving a probabilistic standard of 0.1 loss of load. We calculated monthly Elcc values for wind, storage, and hybrid and solar technologies across a variety of penetration levels. The objective is to share results with stakeholders, solicit comments. We're here to present to revise the Elcc values and PRM values for debate and comment in the current RA proceeding. And we're here to discuss how the overall loss of load and the Elcc framework here presented fits in the RA reform discussion. Inputs and methods. Assumption updates. We started from assumptions used in the 2021 IRP Preferred System Plan. The decision was issued December 22, 2021. I think it's since been adopted, including baseline electric generation resources. 2020 IPER update, mid electric demand forecasts with the high electric vehicle assumption. Include LSC's IRP filings, planned and in development resources, plus the midterm reliability decision ordered procurement. Our wind shapes are updated a little bit from previous studies. We sourced from higher quality satellite data. That's what the MERA data set is. That's a NASA satellite data set. It has improved negative correlation with the hot weather. Hybrids now modeled, some with solar charging restriction or a cap on combined capacity. And we sourced this data from the LSC IRP filings from 2020 and earlier in 2021. System constraints. We changed some of this. I think this was all included in the IRP modeling, except that the 4,000 megawatt import constraint in our ending 1722 was imposed on all 12 months of the year instead of only June through September, as studied in the IRP preferred system plan. That's a typo, the PSP, sorry about that. Storage constraints. This was also in the IRP PSP from discussion with ISO Department of Market Monitoring. Actually, we were able to configure the model. We added some data to the model to take into account some of the observations from the Department of Market Monitoring. Average outage rate for forced outage rate for batteries, about 5%. We have the observation that some of the batteries didn't really want to discharge all the way to zero and then cycle, full discharge, full charge. So we put a constraint in there that generally batteries charge, only discharge up to 90%. We leave about 10% in there, but again, that's able to be overridden with a high enough price. And if reliability events force batteries to discharge more than 90%, that's also implemented in the model. So this is likely to have a limited effect on reliability events, but it may have effects on price or GHG results in the event those aren't reliability events. Also, we implemented no sharing of operating reserves between the intra-CAISO regions. So each CAISO region had to procure their own reserves, which are now set at 6% requirement, as opposed to the 4.5% that it used to be in at least prior year resource adequacy modeling. We've been modeling at 6% here in the IRP modeling for a year or so now. Definitions, this blue star says that this is for Kevin to help me with. So Kevin, you want to go ahead?
Yep, happy to. So just a couple of definitions of terms. 1 day and 10-year standard, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Because we're modeling some monthly reliability, and Donald will talk more about this as he goes along, some questions in terms of whether or not we're still targeting the same standard. I just wanted to confirm that primary goal is on an annual basis. We are targeting a 0.1 1 day in 10 years where we have 1 or more hours of firm load shed. When we stress test the system by looking at a smaller load resource balance in each month, we are going to surface some additional loss of load expectation, which means that the total, when we look at this on a monthly basis, won't match up the 0.1, but we still believe that these results are consistent with planning toward a 0.1 LOLE. When we define the reserve margin, obviously we have to normalize for the reliability contribution of resources. Ultimately, we are working with the CPUC and E3 to move toward a construct where we normalize for every resource class. And that may be through different terminology for different resource classes, but ultimately ELCC and UCAP, other terms are intended to represent that the contribution of resources from a reliability perspective are equivalent. So when we look at the ELCC of a resource, we're trying to compare its reliability contribution to a perfect capacity resource. So we will do simulations where we perform runs with the resource included, and then when we will replace that resource with perfect capacity, and the ratio of perfect capacity that produces the same reliability level as the energy limit or non-dispatchable resource will determine the ELCC. When we look at ELCC, for accounting purposes, we're typically using average ELCC because we need to understand the aggregate contribution of the energy limited portfolio. The marginal ELCC is just the rate of contribution on the margin. The next megawatt of this resource added, what's its contribution? And in a resource accounting, resource accreditation standpoint, it makes sense to use average ELCC. Marginal procurement decisions, obviously you'd want to use marginal ELCC for that. But in the context of this accounting exercise that we're going to be talking through, everything's going to be explained in terms of average ELCC. Next slide, Donald. Donald, can you advance to the next slide?
I think I got it there.
Okay. Refreshing for me. There we go. Resource diversity. So in order to understand the reliability contribution of resources, you have to understand the diversity effects that take place when you introduce multiple technologies. So we expect as you add solar and you add battery, there's some interactive effects. And with some resource classes, there will be positive diversity. You can also have negative diversity between resource classes, depending on how correlated those resources are. So when we look at the average ELCC of an individual resource class, we actually have to run lots of different combinations of simulations. And we've taken a little bit different approach to calculating the average ELCC in this exercise. We recognize some shortfalls with prior methods where we would remove one technology. For instance, if we were looking at solar ELCCs, we might remove the fixed PV resource class, look at the ELCC for the tracking PV, and then try to allocate the diversity benefits accordingly. The problem is the different portfolio sizes can influence the allocation of diversity. And so we landed on a better method that was introduced by E3 that's called the delta method. I'll talk about some complications that we run into in performing monthly ELCCs, but ultimately that's the method that we are attempting to implement, is to look at the contribution on the margin for the first megawatt that's added for every resource class, look at the contribution from the last megawatt that's added, and then make sure that we understand kind of that trend through the construction of the entire portfolio, allocate the total reliability contribution to each resource class accordingly. I'll talk through
Should I
calculation.
move the slide forward here?
Yeah, you can go ahead and move the slide. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, kind of the difference between what you may have been introduced to with respect to the delta method and the actual method that we ended up implementing.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a second to update on my side. There we go.
Mm-hmm.
So I mentioned the first in ELCC, so we calculate the marginal ELCC. You can imagine for solar, the first megawatt of solar that's added is going to have a higher value. The last megawatt of solar that's added is going to have very little value because we've seen that decline in the marginal ELCC. For batteries, same idea. First megawatt's going to have a lot of value. Last megawatt will have less value. The slope of those, ultimately the integration of each of those, is approximately the average ELCC. The delta method is going to adjust for that diversity by scaling those benefits proportionally to allocate the total portfolio ELCC. I like to think of it in the context of If I take the first in ELCC, so I got these really high values, and I multiply it by the nameplate capacity, I'm going to get this really large portfolio reliability value. If I take the last in ELCC, multiply it by the portfolio, the megawatts of the installed capacity of each resource, we get a very small value. When we do the calculation for the entire portfolio, we're going to get a value that's somewhere in between the first in and the last in. So total megawatts might be 20 gigawatts for the first in, 10 gigawatts for the last in, and the portfolio shows 15 gigawatts. That's kind of roughly the numbers that we're seeing for the summer months. The delta method is going to allocate those megawatts so that the sum of each of those adds up to the portfolio ELCC. And it will take into account some convexity in the shape of those ELCCs. It's not going to be a linear shape that as you add solar, the first megawatt's worth 20%, the last one's worth 0%, and it slopes linearly. The delta method allows you to perfectly allocate those megawatts so that you get back to that total portfolio ELCC. For our approach, because we didn't have last in ELCCs for every month, we had to modify the method because our portfolio value was outside the bounds of that first in calculation and that last in calculation. So we allocated the megawatts assuming that we had a perfectly linear slope, and then we scaled each of those resource classes to get to the total portfolio value. In future studies, we intend to be able to calculate last in ELCCs for every resource class for every month, which will allow us to use the delta method more in line with how it's been put forward by E3. Happy to take questions on that later, but I'm going to leave that discussion there for now. Jump to the next slide, Donald.
Waiting. It's waiting on it. There you go.
Showing.
Seeing it yet?
Yep, there we go. Okay, so I've already introduced some of these concepts, just kind of formulaic here, explaining. So we calculate the portfolio average ELCC, remove the entire portfolio, add back in perfect capacity until we get the LOLE back to the target level. Each month is different. Each month's LOLE is different. The summer months have more loss of load expectation than off-season months. And Donald will talk about the PRM, the way that he tuned the monthly LOLE. But our goal is to get back to that starting point. So we remove the portfolio, add back in perfect capacity until we get the LOLE to our target level. That perfect capacity will be less than the installed capacity of the portfolio. That ratio will define the average ELCC for the entire portfolio. And then to do go ahead and jump to the next slide. But to do the allocation by technology,
You should see it.
Updated yet for me. I can go ahead and talk through it, but so to allocate that entire portfolio ELCC back to each respective technology, as I mentioned, we calculate the first in marginal ELCC. So we remove the entire portfolio, and then we're doing this in 1,000 megawatt block sizes. Ultimately, with the granularity in the model and looking at very small reliability values, so very low LOLE per month, 0.003 in some cases. We had to add a relatively large block of technology in order to get kind of convergent reliability metrics out of the model. So we add that 1,000 megawatt block of technology, and then we will add perfect load. So it's the reverse of the perfect capacity. So we're just making reliability worse by adding perfect blocks of load until we get back to that target level. Marginal ELCC then is the perfect load divided by 1,000 megawatts. And we will repeat that for each technology group in the portfolio. For the last in marginal ELCC, similar approach, but you leave in the entire portfolio, then add the 1,000 megawatt block of technology, add in perfect load until you get back to the starting point, starting reliability level, and that ratio will define the last in ELCC. And then we apply the delta method to calculate the technology specific average ELCCs. As I mentioned, our modified method in this case is to assume linearity from the first in to the last in, and then we scale every technology to get us to the total portfolio ELCC. That allows us to avoid having cases where the technology specific ELCC is higher than either the first in and the last in, or lower than either of the first in and last in. So the ultimate ELCCs that you'll find will be somewhere between it'll be consistent across technologies in that it'll either be all lower or all higher, or in between the first in and last in ELCC. And in a little bit, I'll talk through the specific results that we found and kind of give you a little bit more context for how the method calculations took place. All right, Donald, I think that's all for me at this point.
All right. Base portfolio level results in PRM calculation. Do we want to stop and take some questions now, or do we want to just continue on to the next section and then take questions after that section? What do you think?
Put a few questions in the chat, Donald.
Yeah. Scott Olson asks, with some errors with storage dispatch that were identified in the IRP PSP decision. I think the answer is yes. I think what we identified in the PSP decision was related to the price at which storage is dispatched, and I think we specifically mentioned that we changed the storage dispatch price up to, again, a very high value, so that the reliability based dispatch doesn't get overridden, except in very extreme price circumstances. That references that. So Scott, I think the answer to your question is yes. The basis of the 4,000 megawatt import constraint, and why is it the same value for all 12 months? 4,000 megawatt import constraint derived from collaboration or coordination with the resource adequacy team. We identified what were firm import contracts, about the level of firm import contracts that we were seeing in the resource adequacy filings. It was the same value in all 12 months, just for purposes of making a month-specific reserve margin and ELCC calculation. We wanted to have the amount and sort of the operation of capacity be about the same in all 12 months, and that was because we have to do a month-specific reserve margin and ELCC calculation. That's why it's the same for all 12 months, just to keep all the constraints and the accounting the same. Yeah, probably not likely going to see the exact same constraints applied in exact same hours in all 12 months, but we wanted to make sure that we kept the accounting working. For resources in the model, we didn't use the net qualifying capacity as an input. We accounted for resources in our PRM calculation, both using the existing NQC calculations, and for those that are ELCC based, we compared new ELCC values versus old ELCC values just to show the difference. So I think when we set how big a generator is in the model, its max capacity is derived from the net dependable capacity value that's on the CAISO master generating capability list. The NQC is applied after the fact as a accounting step, but is not an import into the model. I hope that answers that question. Shusheng has a couple of questions about the mechanisms of the first in and last in marginal ELCC studies. I think the answer here, his question is when you calculate the first in and last in marginal ELCC, would the wind or solar capacity stay the same? I think when we calculate the first in and last in for, say, solar, does the wind capacity stay constant? I think the answer to that is yes. But Kevin, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. I think the answer to that is yes. And then likewise, when we're doing the first in and last in wind, the solar stays the same.
So for first in, all resources are removed and we only add in 1,000 megawatts of solar. So the wind capacity doesn't exist in the first in calculation. For the last in, everything is in, all the solar and all the wind is in. So the wind capacity would be there for the last in marginal ELCC calculation for solar.
Okay, so the first in calculation for, say, wind capacity would be the first in wind on a system that didn't include any wind, solar, or storage.
That's right.
All right, well, thank you for correcting me on that then. I want to make sure that I give the right answer here. So that applies to all the technologies, storage, wind, solar, and hybrids. The same method applies then.
That's correct.
Okay. I don't think we have numerical examples. Somebody asked for a numerical example. I don't think we have any in this slide deck here that particularly show each individual step, but I think maybe we have some more information in the study results document itself. And if more is necessary, please email us afterwards and we'll see what we can provide as far as more numerical examples. I'm going to take this one. The target loss of load for every month is discussed in the next couple of slides. June through September, we targeted 0.1 as the total across those 4 months, with some, with some rounding there. As far as the other 8 months, the off-peak months, we tried to get what we considered de minimis but non-zero loss of load, and that meant a very small value but not zero. We needed to make sure that we were reaching that edge where you start to see loss of load. It's like wanted to make sure that we surfaced loss of load so that we knew we were at the minimum reserve margin, and so that when we did ELCC calculations, we had a target to return loss of load to. So that's why we did that. So yeah, just again to summarize, the 4 summer months, 0.1 target for June through September, and the other 12 months were de minimis but non-zero loss of load. Didn't necessarily set a particular number for that, but about 0.002 in each month. So that would be about 0.01, maybe 0.015 total across the other 8 months.
Donald, looks like there was
a question.
I don't know if we're trying to get each question in series here, but there was a question from Scott Murdishaw.
Oh, good. You're seeing those questions too. Okay. Go ahead.
It says, do you have a sense of whether your modification to the Delta method results in a higher ELCC for solar? So we did perform the calculation with the original Delta method calculations. And as I mentioned, what it does is for a resource that has an inclining ELCC, so wind has an inclining ELCC, say it goes from 10% to 20% for a given month, the Delta method, given that the portfolio value is outside the first in and last in total, it ends up forecasting a value higher than either the first in or the last in for wind, and then it's lower for the other technologies. So really that was kind of where the differentiation fell, is that wind and storage got changed in off-peak months. Peak months, honestly, were pretty similar. I just looked at the solar values. If we'd used the original Delta method, they were all within 0.5%. So for July, August, September, it the solar values were within 0.5%. Back to the original Delta method. The impact was really to the wind and the storage.
Okay. Kevin, do you want to get this one about if the LCC were applied to gas, would it receive a diversity adjustment?
Yep, so we do see that if you actually run simulations for the thermal fleet versus just accounting for the E4D of the resource, that we would expect the impact to be larger. And this is largely driven by variability of outages. So we know that the system doesn't always, if the system has an E4D of 5%, we know that it's not consistent every hour of the year that we have 5% of the fleet offline. Some days it'll be 10%, some days it'll be 0%. We have to plan for outages at something higher than the median or the average. So if we're looking at the reliability implications, we're probably closer to the 70% confidence level of outages on the system. So a 5% E4 system might have a 7% impact on reliability. So we'd expect, instead of getting a 95% accreditation, it would probably get a 92 or 93% accreditation. I would expect that would be a good approach to normalizing the true reliability contribution of every resource class. So if you run this Eocc and you get that impact, probably need to take into account for resources that have higher ELCCs or lower ELCCs. But ultimately, that modeling-based method would do a better job of accounting for the differences between the thermal, or normalizing for the reliability contribution between firm resources and non-firm resources.
All right. I'm going to jump in here with a couple here that I think I can do quick. Assume storage duration, it was 4 hours. So the megawatt hours in the battery is 4 times the megawatt of the battery. Pumped hydro storage, yes, is taken out of the baseline. And how is that reflected in the storage ELCCs? The pumped hydro is included in the grouping of storage resources, which means that the percentages that the ELCC percentages for storage that we have here apply also to pump storage, are meant to apply also to pump storage as well as batteries. I think the next question about when you calculate ELCCs for storage, does the solar stay constant? I think we answered that for the last in and first in storage. We do the same as we do with everything else. And when I calculate the last in marginal ELCC of solar, we included all the solar capacity. We summarize how much solar we saw in the fleet. We did not include behind the meter solar, but all the supply side solar. And again, I think we again say this later, we're only looking at what's in CAISO. We're not looking at remote generators. The remote generators are left in, and they're part of the unspecified import amounts that we have, but we're not specifically doing any LCC study for the outside CAISO remote solar or wind or storage. I think I ticked off a few of them there. Mark Specht asks a few more questions about the way that the original Delta method differs from the modified Delta method. And I'm reading this other question. Kevin, why don't you see if you have, do we have any more information in which the modified Delta method differs from the original Delta method, in addition to what we already put in the paper that went out?
Yeah, we could probably provide another illustration of the difference between them. And I'm not sure what the policy is on how much information to release or not. Happy to put that together. Again, just kind of summary level data that I gave you before is that, particularly in the summer months, it doesn't make much difference between all the resource classes, and some of the non-summer months it makes more of a difference, and that's primarily isolated to wind and storage. I will say that the intention is to eventually use the original. That requires getting a last in monthly ELCC, which we didn't have time to run for this, so we had to rely on the annual ELCC number, which ultimately is probably not a good proxy for several of the resource classes for winter months, for non-summer months. So since we didn't have monthly last in ELCCs by technology, we're kind of forced our hand to modify the method to get the results to directionally make sense. So
Okay.
we'll take that as a follow-up to figure out how much information to supply. Kim?
All right, thank you. Deborah Bayless, were there any assumptions made for the new demand-side programs from the emergency OIR? I think we included everything that was in the emergency OIR except the new demand response capacity, about 300 or 400 megawatts of that, as I recall. I think we did not include the new demand response, but we did include all the other stuff, the solar storage and wind that was in the emergency OIR, just not that demand response. When we do further studies, or in particular studies of demand response, we'll be including that. But just not that additional megawatts that were in the emergency OIR for 2024. And I think one more question here from David McMillan. An underlying assumption seems to be that there is just one scenario on any day that can lead to loss of load. I'm going to summarize here that there's multiple distinct scenarios that could lead to loss of load in any hour or on any given day. Excessive load is one, lack of storage, and other scenarios. Should multiple loss of load scenarios for each hour be explored? What I'll say to that is that we do this loss of load study over 20 different weather years, which means that we are attempting to explore different variability as related to weather and all the ways that the fleet operates around weather scenarios. Each weather year is simulated at 5 different economic and demographic forecast points. So we have 20 weather years times 5 economic and demographic uncertainty, error rates. And so there's really 100 cases, 5 times 20 is 100. So we run 100 cases, and each of those 100 cases is run at multiple iterations, either 40 or 50, I forgot what the paper said, 40 or 50 iterations to simulate all the different, at least several outage draws, stochastic outage draws on power plants. And then a probability weighted expected value is taken at the end when it comes to loss of load. The probability weighted expected value is taken across 100 cases at 40 or 50 outage draws each case. So with all that, I do think that we're taking, at least, I don't know about totally and 100% comprehensive, but we're covering at least all the loss of load risks, different scenarios of loss of load risk that, the majority of the ones that are reasonably foreseeable. So that, I think we're doing a pretty good job on that. So yeah, we, outage draws, different weather variation, different weather years, and different economic and demographic forecast points. And then, of course, all the resources dispatch around all those conditions, and those are part of the different iterations, and then expected value at the end. So a whole lot of variability is modeled. There's probably other things we can think of as it relates to intra-hour uncertainty, and we could probably create some variables around forecast uncertainty on an intra-hour basis and that sort of thing. But we're doing a pretty good job. We're doing a very comprehensive job. Just wanted to explain to you the ways in which we're doing a very comprehensive job.
I'd agree, Donald. So from a resource adequacy perspective, making sure we have enough capacity on the ground to meet the reliability needs, we're looking at, Donald mentioned all the combinations, but 5,000 different scenarios for every day of the year. So 5,000 January 1, 5,000 July 15th. Representations that should capture lots of different ways that can lead into a reliability event, whether it's an energy constraint, a capacity constraint, an import constraint. I do feel like we're using history as a guide to build a wide enough net to capture as many of the possible loss of load risks that we could envision.
All right. I think as it's about 1:45, I should probably move on to the next section. It looks like that's all the questions that I've got in chat right now anyway, so I think we're ready to move on. Oh, and one more question, repeat whether we used install. So when we're putting the input into the model, we're using the net dependable capacity of the resource, or what we think the nameplate or capmax is from LSC filings or MTR procurement. At the end, when we're doing our PRM calculation, which I'm about to show you, the accounting for it at the end, the post-processing accounting and calculating a reserve margin will reduce it to its net qualifying capacity, or our attempt to calculate a net qualifying capacity. But as far as what goes into the model, it's its nameplate or PMAX, trying to operate the power plants at their nameplate or PMAX, and then see how they operate, and then valuing them at an ELCC afterwards as a post-process, after the loss of load study. Anyway, I hope that's an answer to that question. All right, let's begin. And again, there may be some slides here that Kevin will help me with, but let's jump into the PRM calculation. The PRM calculation is the sum, I hope you're seeing these slides, sum effective ELCC or UCAP capacity of all the units present in the system, what I just said, that they're net dependable. We use the NQC counting for units in the PRM calculation that aren't part of the ELCC calculation. We use its ICAP or UCAP level. The first step of an ELCC calculation is the portfolio ELCC, which means the total ELCC of all the stuff, the wind, solar, batteries, pump storage, and hybrids. We determine the level of imports that can be relied on to support reliability, and that's that 4,000 megawatt value that we mentioned. We extract the median sales peak demand that's modeled in the servo model as the peak demand that goes in the denominator there. And then we determine the PRM adjustment for planned outages based on the minimum daily megawatt value on outage for each month. You can see how the calculation plays out there. In number 5, PRM equals sum of the effective capacity plus the effective capacity of the portfolio in the ELCC work, minus the effective capacity of units on planned outage, plus the firm imports amount, minus 1, divided by median megawatt sales peak, all that fraction minus 1 to determine what the reserve margin is. And the UCAP PRM is the same as step 5, except for all the stuff that's not part of the ELCC calculation. We also multiply it by its forced outage rate, 1 minus forced outage rate. So see if I can get to the next slide there. Great, it worked. Monthly PRMs and ELCCs. The RA program, of course, is monthly, so the studies are configured to produce monthly PRMs. So we do all this work on a monthly basis as well. It requires targeting loss of load level in each month individually. I mentioned that already. For the CAISO system, the peak demand generally occurs in June to September, so loss of load is concentrated in those months. Already kind of walked through this. Needed to calibrate all the 12 months to surface loss load in the off-peak months. That meant removing some existing units, the ones that aren't part of the portfolio to calculate ELCCs. We wanted to keep the wind, solar, batteries, and hybrids the same in all 12 months, just so the ELCC calculation works. So when we're calibrating by removing the other stuff, And so the other stuff that I mean that was removed to calibrate the system is here summarized. Negative value. So we have CAISO installed capacity there in that first column. And then the 12 months negative values represent amounts removed. in order to surface loss of load events that July, August, September are there highlighted in yellow because those are the peak months where we see the most loss of load. As you see, particularly in August, all that we're really removing there is 1 unit of Diablo and the cogen fleet. We could have probably done something different. Oh, and we also took out the Intermountain, so you don't see any coal in there either. We could probably have done this differently if we wanted to, say, remove some of the wind, solar, and batteries, and then saw what it was like if we left a Diablo unit in. The intuition is that the reserve margin would not have been different because we're still counting everything at its effective capacity, so that would have normalized across those differences. But yeah, so there's values that were removed. You saw that we removed significant amounts in the off-peak months, and that's attributable to the large decrease in peak load in those off-peak months. We did it by looking at which one was oldest to the newest, and so we went from oldest to newest to remove capacity here. Just the general way that we did that. Monthly loss of load of the calibrated system. You see the results here. We have 789, that's July, August, September. You see how we have the most loss of load there. 0.31, 0.44, and 0.043 together, they add, and 0.014, they add up to about 0.13, which is likely to approximate the 0.1 annual target. We're of course imposing additional stress or constraints that are probably not present in reality. Some of the import constraints and some of the ways that we're modeling. So 0.1, so these results are in the summer, 6, 7, 8, 9, they're likely to approximate the 0.1 annual reliability target. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 11, 12 there. You see a little bit extra in May there, but you see that these other months are tuned to have de minimis but non-zero loss of load amounts in them, just so that we have a target to shoot for when we're doing ELCC studies. And I wanted to know what the minimum reserve margin was actually in those months. So I had to see what that sort of edge or frontier was as far as that loss of load. The base portfolio here, when we did our ELCC work, the first portfolio we ran was this base portfolio, and it included everything you see here. We had existing online, plus the LSC plans and development resources, plus about 4,000 megawatts of batteries that came from the Resolve model. And this is also what was included in the preferred system plan, the PSP modeling results, or the decision that just went out in December. You see the portfolio totals there on the right. Hybrids, we have hybrids, which are a mixture of solar and storage. You see that we broke out the PSET solar, the PSET storage. The combined amount there is slightly less than the total of the solar and the storage, because some of these resources, specifically in the IRP plans, told us that there was a max interconnected capability sort of limit there, so a max interconnection amount that we implemented for the paired solar and storage. And so the hybrid combined amounts were what went into the model. You see that we took you see that we have about 2,000 or 2,100 megawatts of pump storage that is existing. That was taken out of the portfolio also to do the ELCC study. I think that also answers a question somebody had. And this only represents the in-CAISO resources. We're not using out-of-state wind or solar here as part of this ELCC calculation. I think I have a slide that makes that even more obvious later. So the base portfolio included large amounts of new construction. The LSC plans and development resources represents projects under development as reported in the IRP plans, filed September 2020, and then updated at least once in 2021. The additional capacity selected in Resolve represents what the Resolve model selected to fill out the remaining MTR procurement need that wasn't already counted with LSC plans and development resources. new construction to meet reliability targets in 2024 includes nearly 9,000 megawatts of installed capacity of new storage, and that's including the hybrid storage. So that's a lot. Just highlighting that that's a lot. The base portfolio monthly ELCC results. You see the bottom there is comparing the February 2019 ELCC study that we did. The top there in the darker black font is the base portfolio that we modeled and that we're showing you here. The portfolio effective capacity of all at 43,774 megawatts of CapMax is summarized in that portfolio effective capacity megawatts there in that row by month. It varies anywhere from 23-ish percent up to a high of about 41% in July there. Making the point about remote generators, you see how wind in 2019 we had 10,522 megawatts of wind. This time we have 8,279. That reflects that this study is modeling only in CAISO wind, and so we have about roughly 2,000 megawatts of remote wind and that we did not include. And of course, the February 2019 studies didn't pull out the pump storage also, and so you can see how just a different way we modeled led to different values. I just wanted to highlight that wind capacity did not decline in 2 years. It's just we took out we did not do an ELCC study for the out-of-state wind this time, but that was included in the ELCC study we performed in 2019. Okay, moving on. Here's the base portfolio PRM calculation. There's method 1, which is your ICAP version, and then method 2 is the UCAP version. ICAP installed capacity, UCAP unforced capacity, just making sure I say that slowly. So the ICAP calculation, we removed planned outages but not forced outages. So the PRM needs to be a little bigger with the UCAP method, method 2 over to the right, units with forced outages using E4D statistic in particular, have, they're derated a little bit based on the forced outages, and so the PRM can be a little smaller because now you don't have that, the intuition is so you don't have that variability related to forced outages as part of your reserves explicitly. You're trying to derate the rest of the fleet by that amount.
Yeah, just to be clear, it's the same portfolio in both of these cases. We're just doing the accounting differently between them.
Yep. The height of the bar in the height of the big bar with all the different colors in it, the height of that is equal in both method 1 and method 2. Implications from using Servum monthly peaks, in particular related to the IPER, the Energy Commission's forecast. Servum, we use 20 weather years, as I mentioned, 20 different weather years. And the monthly distribution of demand differs between the IPER's annual hourly load model and their allocation to individual months relative to the 20 weather year electric demand shapes that are developed for use in this Servum model. And we develop the 20 weather years of electric demands because, at least for the time being, at least now currently, we only have one hourly load model coming out of the IPER. And so in our efforts to explicitly simulate weather variability, we kind of had to create that those data inputs independent of the IPER. To remain internally consistent, so staff used the median monthly peaks from Servum, what is in the model, to determine the reserve margin, since that was the monthly peak distribution that the model was targeting to meet, rather than the hourly peak or the monthly peaks from the IPER. The Servum median annual peaks are a little higher than any of the median monthly peaks, and that's because over the course of the last 20 years, we've had peaks in July, peaks in August, and peaks in September. And so because the peaks generally can occur in any of those, primarily those 3 summer months, the annual peak, you know, may be a little higher than all the Junes or all the Julys or all the Augusts or all the Septembers individually. So we annualize the median monthly peaks in Servum by scaling the median monthly peaks by the ratio of the annual peak to the highest median monthly peak. So that ensures that the median annual peak matches the highest median monthly peak, and that makes for a more consistent reserve margin calculation. Do you want to say a little more about that, Kevin, or did I explain it roughly correctly? Well, I guess I explained it correctly. So this is base portfolio monthly PRM results. Is everybody seeing this slide? Let's see, everybody's still there. The base portfolio monthly PRM results. You can see that ICAP, the installed capacity, that would be the method 1 from the slide we just had, would show about 20% reserve margin, and that's not counting forced outages. The unforced capacity, the UCAP reserve margin from this base portfolio results is about 16-ish%. So you see that the impact of forced outages, and now our forced outage, our E4D statistic, is a little different than what the ISO is thinking about. I'm just going to draw the distinction here that our E4D value does not include ambient derates or derates due to temperature, just the derates due to equipment failure. So our impacts, so the impacts of E4D are in the 4-ish, 3.5-ish% level. You know, 16 to 19, 17 to 21 is about 3.5% different. It's a little smaller than if we also included ambient derates in that UCAP derate. I want to say a little more about February there with a little red box around it. Higher PRM in February. I know it looks odd, so I'll explain. It's driven by a difference in optimal annual maintenance scheduling and optimal monthly, optimal annual maintenance versus optimal monthly maintenance. And it's driven by the high EUE during the import constrained hours, leading to more need for internal generation. But we're confident that the 20% PRM across the whole year that we're talking about here, the 20 or the 16% reserve margins that we're talking about here, will suffice in the real market operations. As you see, February's peak is a lot lower than the annual peak. So we're confident that February's results don't present a challenge to anything to what we got here.
Hey, Donald, I'm back. Apologies for I got cut off there.
Yeah, I saw that. So we're just getting through this base portfolio monthly PRM results slide, and I just explained what February was there, and I just read that note that we have at the bottom here. So if you want to say anything more about that, or I'll just wait till I get to questions on this.
Yeah, we can wait for questions.
Yeah, I'm ready. I think I'm moving on. Okay, well, that looks like the end of it anyway. So let's do some questions. I'm going to do a time check. 2:03. So I think we have probably about 10 minutes here for some questions. Open up the chat, see if there's any I can get to. Okay.
We have a question from Noah.
Hey, Donald, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power. Can you talk about maybe the sensitivities of the amount of capacity needed to go from 0.13 in the summer to something lower on a, whether it be a 0.01 type of basis?
The amount of capacity needed to go from, say, 0.13 to 0.1?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like about how much that would be? I don't know. I think I can make an estimate here is probably a couple hundred, 300, but it's also related to some of the constraints that we put on the model. So it could be that removing some of those other constraints also do the same thing. And so that would be my intuition. Kevin, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, just to add a little bit context there. So, we've introduced these artificial constraints on even some of the summer months. So I think in 1 month, we didn't adjust the capacity in that month. So we would expect its loss of load expectation to be what we're publishing here. The other months, they'll have higher loss load expectation because of those artificial constraints. If we remove those artificial constraints, we would expect the summer LOLE to get back to 0.1. So you can look at the magnitude of the difference in adjustments for those other months to see kind of the estimated impact to get back to 0.1. So it's that artificial imposition in those months that's driving us to be something higher than 0.1. I use the illustration, we've run reserve margin studies around the world, and in Malaysia, because every single month they have reliability risk, they have to carry a 35% reserve margin in order to maintain an annual 1 day in 10 standard. So in the same way with this example, by attempting to surface reliability in every month, we're kind of raising the overall reliability events. You need to carry a higher reserve margin to stay at 0.1. But since those were artificial adjustments just used to identify that load resource balance in each month, we still feel it's consistent with the 1 day in 10 standard.
Yeah, the way, at least, as I read the analysis is somewhat confusing at times because, when we talk about having to reach 0.1, we're trying to use this analysis, but the analysis kind of says, but it's maybe close enough, we think, but it doesn't really give a guideline of what is the sensitivity to actually get to 0.1 potentially. It just does a lot of variability there. The PRM that you have also is based only on the capacity values that are sort of being established within this report, right? If different capacity values are used, such as things like what we have now, where we use Pmax for storage resources rather than the Elcc values, the PRMs would also need to be sort of recalibrated to get to account for the increase. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's totally correct. The reserve margin calculation is dependent on both how much actual capacity needs to operate in the system, and then secondarily what its accounting is as far as its derate from cap max, say, to the effective capacity amount. And so, yes, those two things are part of the same piece, which is why we're doing them both at the same time here.
Okay. Great.
And that's why you do a loss load study first, then an Elcc study. Yeah, that.
Right. Yeah. Ultimately, you see the connection between the loss of load study and the Elcc study, that if we're doing our calculation of the Elcc correctly, the reserve margin will remain effectively static. The only thing that would drive the reserve margin to change would be changes in load shape or the change in the size of the system. But ultimately, you should have a relatively constant reserve margin, PRM, if you're calculating your Elccs correctly. You allocate those megawatts according to the reliability contribution that they bring. If you start to introduce arbitrary accreditation resources that are assigned megawatts it's not consistent with their reliability contribution, you'll get a volatile PRM.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
I think that answers Scott Olson's question there also later, where he's talking about that the calibration units were all sort of thermal firm capacity I think that answers that question, that the reserve margin won't change, and that's because like we're all, the ELCC studies also derate the non-firm capacity significantly down to the level of its, usefulness.
Let's go to Matt Barmack.
You want to go? Okay.
Hey, this is Matt Barmack. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hey, Donald and Kevin. I was just wondering if you could explain the normalization of the peak loads that's described on slide 25 a little bit more. I didn't really understand the description of this in the report, and I'm still not sure that I get it. So yeah, what is the justification for this adjustment? Is it so that the PRMs that come out of this analysis are comparable to like the annual PRMs that have been calculated in IRP? Or I got lost here, so maybe you can just explain this a little bit more, please.
I think you got it. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, if you want me to weigh in here.
Yeah, go ahead.
So recognizing that the obligation to meet the PRM is based on the IPER forecast, which uses kind of a typical shape where the annual peak matches the highest monthly peak.
Mm-hmm.
Out of Servum, because we're representing statistics across 20 years, our forecast value for July or August or September, none of those months is going to match the annual peak. So it varies from year to year when the annual peak occurs. And so we're really kind of comparing apples and oranges there, recognizing the applications on the IPER, which has a typical shape where the peak matches the monthly peak, the highest monthly matches the annual peak. So we perform the same adjustment to get a typical shape where our highest monthly value matches the annual peak. And then you can compare to an annual PRM, because the PRM that we published, part of the MTR work last year, we're calculating the reserve margin on the median or average annual peak. And so that gets us back in line with the types of reserve margins that we saw for the summer. So we just felt like it was more appropriate, given the application of these, to use a typical shape rather than a median monthly value out of the model from the 20 weather years.
Okay, so there are really two aspects that I'm hearing. One is just sort of to make your sampling framework consistent with the IPER forecast. That's one. But then, yeah, so you do think that, sort of a monthly PRM in this framework is comparable to an annual PRM. Yeah, I guess it's not intuitively obvious to me. I can see why it might be, but
Yeah.
is that necessarily always the case?
It's not. So if load forecasting was done on a basis that respected or recognized the difference between the monthly peak and the annual peak, so each of the 4 summer months have a value that is lower than the annual peak, then it would make sense to use the kind of the median monthly value straight out of Servum. And so you get reserve margins in the summer of 22 or 23%. So in that context, it would be applicable. We're just trying to kind of respect the application of these where you do have that constraint that the max monthly matches the annual peak.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thanks for that clarification.
Great. I'm going to see if I can buzz through a few of these questions here over chat. Unit, so Efa Musa asks, what do you mean by capacity of units not in the portfolio? And portfolio only means the portfolio being tested in the ELCC study. And so that's solar, wind, storage, including pump storage, and the hybrid units. The stuff not in the portfolio is the firm resources, that are also in the model that aren't being tested in the ELCC calculation. And so that's, broadly speaking, all the thermal stuff and the hydro stuff. We aren't doing a ELCC study here either of demand response or of the dispatchable or run-of-river hydro or of the thermal stuff or geothermal or biomass. So that's the stuff that's not in the portfolio. All that means is a portfolio ELCC study. I hope that clarifies that. UCAP is used in the PRM analysis here, does not include ambient D rates, and that's because we're really trying to focus on forced outages, meaning equipment failure outages. So we're not even really looking at places where gas or fuel is uncertain. We're really only looking at equipment failure, and that's because other methodologies are at least for my personal opinion, more appropriate to things like ambient D rates than this UCAP framework. And later on this year, at least I hope to give this proceeding a little more information as to what we would consider to be the way to do ambient D rates. Using the same sort of multi-weather year stochastic framework. But I'll stay tuned for more information on that. But I think that so the UCAP study here only looks at actual equipment failure, the E4D statistic, specifically from the NERC GADS data as being the indication of equipment failure that we would use in the UCAP calculation. And I hope that we also answer this question from Mark Kutstra. So the ELCC calculation is done on a portfolio ELCC calculation, that is the wind, solar, storage, and hybrid. And then there's other stuff, which is also in CAISO. And so we told you what that is. But all that's in the PRM calculation. And then all imports are represented by the 4,000 megawatt non-specified import amount there. We have a couple of questions about the loss of load values here. 0.6 loss of load, 0.16 LOLE reflects totals across all 12 months. It's not likely that we're going to see loss of load in the off-peak months. We kind of had to do some artificial removal or calibration in order to surface loss of load in those off-peak months. So what we're really focusing on is the peak months there. So it's 0.13 in the peak months, and I think we talked a little bit about why 0.13 is likely to approximate 0.1, and that's because of some of the constraints that are in the model that are probably compounded by the month-specific nature of this study, and that are perhaps not, as likely to occur in the real CAISO market. We're confident that a 0.1, that the 0.13 or that the summer months that we simulate here are likely to approximate the 1 day in 10 target. So to keep going, the PRM, so we showed you what the month-specific loss of load targets are. Those month-specific loss of load targets result in the reserve margin results that we've also showed you, and each individual month loss of load target is the benchmark that we would, use for our ELCC calculation. Chris Devon asks, is a 0.044 loss of load in a single month is, if you annualize that, it's pretty large. If every month had 0.044 loss of load. And yes, it does indicate that there's a higher loss of load in these summer months. That shows we need more resources, particularly in the summer months, which is why our reserve margin calculation is really focused on the summer, but we're confident that the reserve margin we discover from a loss of load study of the summer is sufficient in order to minimize or remove loss of load in the off-peak months also. But it's obvious that, of course, the off-peak months also, have lower peak loads, so there's more resources available in the event that some of those resources need to be brought online in an emergency. But yeah, the peak loads are highest in the summer, and the loss of load results seem like, to say that there's more reliability risk in the summer. And so our proposed reserve margin does reflect the summer months, primarily. Chris also asks about the E4D used for battery storage. The model had an EFOR of 5% put in, which means that the batteries did have outage events in the course of simulation. So so there's not zero outages for batteries. That EFORD of batteries, I presented it to stakeholders, I don't know if that was a month ago, and I think I agreed to look a little harder to see why the inputs that we put in of, I guess, a 5.4% EFOR translated to a 0% EFORD in our model. And I still need to determine, figure out more information about that. But yeah, the batteries did have actual outage events in this model. We did observe outage events. So
that may be a reporting issue. The E4D, we have to define hours that are in demand. So that particular resource is in demand, and that heuristic or rubric is very different for storage than it is for other classes of resources. But it does, as Donald says, it applies that 5% forced outage rate. So whatever its schedule is that we'd like to schedule it for, it's not going to be available for all of that schedule. You're going to have 5% forced outages. So I wouldn't worry about the E4D being reported at 0. We do have the 5% forced outage rate getting applied.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So keeping going here, I think we're going to try to get through a couple more of these in the next couple minutes. ICAP accounting, the PRM accounts only for forced outages of the stuff that's not part of the ELCC calculation. So that would be thermal resources primarily. All the stuff that's part of the ELCC calculation is counted at its ELCC. And as you know, batteries are accounted for at their ELCC, even though they have a forced outage assumption in there. So the reserve margin accounts for forced outages, primarily fossil fuel resources in the UCAP D rate, but outages on things like batteries are included as part of the ELCC values that are arrived at. I think I'm actually getting through here. PRMs of April to June are really low. Do the portfolios in these months meet the loss of load targets? Yes, they do. The reserve margin is sort of a post-processed value, but what we did is make sure that the loss of load in those all those months, April through June, for example, have the results that we showed you in that chart, 0.002, 0.003, something like that, something non-zero, yet really, really small. So the portfolios so the amount of resources in those months, April, May, June, do actually meet the loss load targets. We've demonstrated that by running the model there. So another question about the low PRM values. Does Energy Division think this PRM level will provide sufficient reserves? We rely significantly on VERS in these months. Yeah, so our proposal is a 16% ICAP in all 12 months or a 20% oh, actually, I got that backwards. A 20% ICAP in all 12 months or a 16% UCAP in all 12 months. I'm not proposing a 10 or 5 or whatever the reserve margin is in April, May, June, for April, May, and June. Where the proposal is, or the results here are recommending a 20% ICAP in all 12 months or a 16% UCAP in all 12 months. So I hope that answers that question.
Now, just to be clear on the modeling from the modeling perspective though. So those off-peak months, the timing of the reliability events can differ. So, you know, we've got that 4 gigawatt constraint in the late afternoon hours. If the load resource balance is tighter in some of the other hours in those other months, it can mean that you're getting more imports. So the kind of contribution from the outside world may end up being larger in those months, which would push the reserve margin down for this. But all those kind of factors, we think, you know, there's some aspect that we're artificially surfacing these events, and that's kind of why we still rely on that 16 UCAP, 20% ICAP value for all months.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
also
which is part
that
of the
the
reason.
10% number that's reported is after you've subtracted out the kind of coincident planned outages. So obviously, if you're going to take significant planned outages in those months, you need a higher reserve margin. So what we're reporting is post scheduling those outages. That's the reserves that you need.
Yep. That's an important thing to remember. So yeah, just bottom line, we're not recommending a you know, a 10% or less reserve margin in the off-peak months. It's, you know, like I said, a 20% ICAP or a 16% UCAP. The GAD's forced outage statistic is an annual number. It's not a seasonal or monthly number, but based on whether power plants are needed or used in various months, it's like I think I mentioned this somewhere else. It's that we create a distribute around the GAD's data. We create a distribution of time to repair and time to fail distribution to represent the stochastic nature of forced outages, and the time to fail and time to repair hours are, you know, variables are drawn from when power plants are used or dispatched, not necessarily. So that reflects when they're used. So that kind of puts them in various months. There's also a maintenance rate, which is just a amount of maintenance needed on a given year, and so the servo model schedules that at its most optimal time, and so that's also kind of putting it to a particular season. Our servo model right now models the entire WEC, not just CAISO. We model the entire WEC, but the reserve margin and the Elcc results here only reflect the ISO. We have placed a constraint on the ISO getting unspecified imports from the rest of WEC at a certain level, but the rest of WEC is dynamically modeled, is simulated dynamically. And a question of PRM is calculated on gross peak. Actually, our PRM here is calculated over the net peak amounts. We actually are trying to implement what the RA program construct closely here. So it's a reserve margin over the net peaks, and so that's generally going to be the net. The net peak level is determined by gross peak minus all the demand side modifiers, and so that's going to be more of a net peak calculation.
No, that's not net peak of all the utility scale renewables. So the net peak would fall later for the utility scale. I think it's critical though to mention that the PRM is intended to be static. So between the PRM and the ELCC, you get all those temporal aspects, the peak shifting or the time of stress shifting from July to September, the time of stress shifting from hour 17 to hour 20. All that's going to get reflected in the ELCC. The ELCC is going to capture that dynamic, and then the PRM can stay static. So we still recommend all our clients to continue to use PRM, and you can honestly, you can do the accounting on either the gross or this managed peak, which is net of the behind the meter stuff, or on the net. It's going to stay static though if you report it off of something closer to gross, but ultimately still kind of sticking with kind of the conventional PRM statistic, leave that static, allow the ELCC to capture those dynamics in the way that the timing and the of the reliability events occur.
Yeah.
I mean, especially as you get in, sorry to continue to add to this, as you get into an energy constrained system, kind of the hourly reserves or the slice of day, I have some concerns about implementation of trying to recognize kind of the reserve margin in a specific time period, because it depends on, as somebody mentioned in the chat earlier, depends on what happened earlier in the day. And so ultimately, as you move toward a system that is energy constrained, those types of metrics don't supply as much information. So maintaining kind of the PRM and the ELCC, which is going to capture both capacity constraints and energy constraints, is going to give you the best representation of system reliability and how to achieve it.
We have some
Okay.
hands up. Do you want me to take those?
All right, we can do those. I have a couple more questions on chat to get through, but actually, I'll just get those. I'm not sure if we've limited the exports to WEC. I'll have to check. I don't think we've observed unserved load while CAISO is exporting. I think the model would not want that to happen, but I'll check. I'll make sure of that as well.
Yeah, I can confirm that, Donald. We do not have any unserved load when CAISO is exporting.
Okay. And we are going to value, this study does reveal ELCC values on a month-specific basis. The monthly PRM is mostly there just to confirm that the 20% or 16% that we see we need over the annual peak at least is sufficient for all 12 months, and I think that's been confirmed by the study results. Those are I think those are two quick answers. Now let's do, I think I've got a scenario PRM performed on the calibrated loss load, but prior to surfacing. I think what that would, that's a Paul Nelson question. I think that would just show us that the reserve margin over the annual, over the summer months would be what, we'd still be focusing on that 20% or that 16% in the summer months. We may not see any loss of load in the off-peak months, but still our reserve margin would probably be over the summer, just that 20% or that 16% value. So just.
And Donald, I'll just offer that
value over the summer is a value to look for.
So we did work with E3 last summer on the PRM from an annual perspective, and we did see values that comported with the values that we're showing here. Summer reserve margins in the range of 20 to 21%.
ICAP. I don't think you did a
correct.
UCAP version of it, but the ICAP calculation was very similar to what we've got here over the summer months. Okay. The results here do have ELCC values for storage and hybrids. So we'll decide whether that's appropriate, and if they if storage stays at 100% rather than its ELCC values, then the PRM probably gets a little higher because the storage will be a little So that's just the answer to that question. I think that's the last on chat. Let's move to the ones that have their hands up, and I think then we'll move on to the next.
Let's go to Lizette. Darius.
This is Darius Shamahadi with Calvia. I'm sorry if you have covered this. I joined this conference a bit late, so you may have covered this. You talked about ELCC of battery storage. Did you treat the ELCC of battery? Did you calculate the ELCC battery storage, say for a 4-hour battery storage, as being equal to its nameplate minus its forced outage rate, or you actually calculated the equivalent capacity of a perfect resource that would have equivalent impact as that 4-hour battery storage on the on expected unserved energy?
We did the same thing that we do in other ELCC studies, is we take away the storage and replace it with perfect capacity until we get back to the loss of load target that we had.
So you treat it as
So we
perfect
perform-
capacity, basically,
Mhm.
as megawatt for megawatt. So a 100 megawatt of 4-hour storage has an ELCC of 100 megawatt, unless it has some forced outage rate that you would.
Well, no, it has its ELCC value related to the, as its technology specific ELCC results are shown here, anywhere from, the mid 90s down to the low 80s, depending on the penetration of storage in the portfolio.
Okay.
Yep. So,
Alright.
so those energy constraints are going to prevent it from supplying the same capacity as a perfect generator. That's getting picked up in the ELCC.
Okay, so the energy constraints that it has been captured in the value of ELCC that you calculate for batteries. Battery storage.
That's right.
Yep.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Who's next?
Next is Chris Devon.
Customized Energy Solutions. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
All right, thanks, Donald and Kevin, for the explanations. Just have one quick follow-up on the E4D thing, and then another question. But on the battery E4D, just to try to understand your modeling, because you guys said that you did model it with that 5.3% outage rate. I just don't quite follow, because if it's 0%, 0.0% E4D, then that's really what's driving the actual PRM output from the study, isn't it? Or when it's actually when those resources are actually in demand. It just seems strange to me that the storage would be never having an outage when they would actually be needed in all of the different runs. So I just don't quite follow that. Could you help me maybe try to understand a little bit better?
So we put in the forced outage rate into the model via the time to repair, time to fail statistics. The model is going to sample those for the battery, and when we report out the battery's forced outage rate, it's time to repair divided by time to repair plus time to fail. Now that doesn't have any statistics on whether or not that unit was part of the commitment that it was intended to be operated in that particular hour. So that's a post hoc calculation that's done for the conventional units, where you just look at the dispatch stack and determine whether or not that resource was online. Well, batteries don't really have a dispatch price to do that calculation for it. They're economically scheduled so that they charge during low priced hours and they discharge during high priced hours. But that E4D calculation, which uses the dispatch stack to determine whether or not that unit was in demand, even though it was offline, doesn't get reflected for batteries. So we don't actually have an E4D statistic for batteries coming out of the model, but it did have those time to repair and time to fail events in the simulations. It just doesn't have an E4D statistic that corresponds to what you see for a conventional unit.
Okay.
Yeah.
That helps me. Thank you for the explanation. I was confused by the prior explanation, but this makes more sense to me now. So thanks for that. And then just real quick, the other question I just had on this was, when you guys are looking at that ICAP versus UCAP number, could you just explain at kind of a macro level or higher level for me to how to understand the concept of the ELCC included in that? Is the ELCC approach that you guys applied for these various types like wind, solar, storage, hybrid resources, is that actually all baked into the ICAP number or the UCAP number? And because, I know Kaiso's talked about using ELCC based numbers to set those equivalent to kind of like a UCAP value. So just the interplay between these ELCC based resource counting rules and how that actually impacts the ICAP versus the UCAP, just because I'm not quite clear through the narrative in the report about how that's done.
Yeah.
So any color on that, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
You want me to take this one, Donald, or you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the ELCC for the energy limited non-dispatchable resources is reflected in both the ICAP and the UCAP. Ultimately, we'd love to get to a place where everything, the PRM is reported primarily on a UCAP basis, which in that case, every technology is going to have this normalization process applied. I'd love for every resource class to be normalized via an ELCC rather than this E4D adjustment. E4 has been kind of an approximation or proxy for the reliability contribution of a conventional unit. As I explained earlier, a generator with a 5% E4 probably has a bigger impact on reliability than what's implied by that number. Maybe it's a 92 or a 93% contribution to reliability instead of 95%. That's ultimately where we want to get to. So every resource we calculate an ELCC, and we have one reserve margin where every megawatt is comparable to a perfect generator. So in that case, we're going to have lower reserve margins, but every resource class is going to get adjusted appropriately. So again, the ICAP has the energy limited non-dispatchable portfolio adjusted via the ELCC, and it's also adjusted in the UCAP PRM. It's the only distinction is that the thermal fleet, those units that have the E4D, that's where you get the difference between the ICAP and the UCAP PRM.
Got it. Okay. That helps me out as well. Thanks for the additional color on that. That was just something I was wondering about overall. But yeah, I would just real quickly say that, you know, I tend to agree. I think the best approach is to just try to model everything under ELCC, and then we can get away from the, you know, E4D and that E4 discussion and how it applies with the, you know, with the thermal resources versus these other variable resources that are really more appropriately done with ELCC. So more of a level playing field, I think, if everything is used, you know, that way or modeled that way. But I'll stop now. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Anybody else?
Yeah, let's go to Scott Olson.
Thanks, Scott Olson with NRG. Kevin, thanks for your explanation on my question about should we be looking more at the net peak as opposed to the gross peak. I had to kind of mull that around in my head. Certainly since ELCC is looking at 8760, like you said, it's taking into account a range of contributions of those resources. My concern is as you have more intermittent resources on the grid and the ELCC values of those resources go down, the way the PRM is currently calculated, since it's based off, again, correct me if I'm wrong, it's based off the sales peak, which is the gross peak. Could it potentially be overvaluing what the PRM is because of how the PRM is calculated? So because you're now having lower and lower contributions of the intermittent resources, when that's the numerator of your equation, looking at the denominator of a period of time that isn't really relevant anymore. We don't really care what the reserve margin so much is at the gross peak. We really care what the reserve margin is at the net peak. So if you have a 20% reserve margin at the gross peak, yes, that actually makes you reliable at the net peak. But should we be thinking more about, well, what's the reserve margin we really need at the net peak? Because those are the hours where we actually have the loss of load expectation. So yeah, bottom line there is, could this lead to artificially high numbers because you're planning for a peak where you don't really need the reserves, the gross, when you should be planning for potentially a different peak?
Well, I'll just say the sales peak is already net of all the demand modifier stuff. It's not, which includes behind the meter PV. It's not net of the supply side, wind and solar. So the net peak is already, well, is moving later and later because of primarily the behind the meter PV.
Right, but the
Um,
analysis done here, the sales peak is 6 p.m., 5 or 6 p.m., whatever the sales peak is. But your modeling shows that the hours of real concern are 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m. Those are the hours we really care about. Those are the hours when you have the loss of load. So if we're calculating a PRM based on how much more we need over the 6 p.m. peak, the gross peak, the sales peak, does that artificially create more reserves than what we actually need at that time? Because we really care about reserves at 8 p.m., 9 p.m. when there's a real loss of load expectation.
Yeah, so I mean, it's challenging to disconnect the accounting from the actual, reliability value of the portfolio. And part of this complication is that, we're doing this on the sales peak, and as the behind the meter portfolio grows, then you got a smaller denominator. And that will change the PRM somewhat. But ultimately, you really shouldn't think about the reserves that we've got in those particular time periods. That's not exactly how it plays out in the reliability model. We say we need roughly a 20% reserve margin. It doesn't mean that on average in those gross peak hours, that's the load resource balance in that particular time period. I mean, it complicates it further thinking about things like we're going to carry 6% operating reserves at all times. You've got the load deviation for every month, and Donald's model, his 8760 load profile, it's got the inherent volatility of load at hour 20 versus the load volatility at hour 17. So all those are getting picked up. Certainly to get confidence that the PRM and the ELCC calculations are being done appropriately, it's nice to have a heuristic that you kind of lean back of the envelope and say, hey, if we carry this much reserves and this is what we think the variability in these particular hours is, we've got the right value. I just think a lot of those simple heuristics, rules of thumb kind of go away, especially as you move into this context or this era of energy constraints, where what happened at 12, 1, 2 o'clock really does influence kind of when the reliability events occur. And so the intuitive concept of, well, how much reserves do I have in that net load peak hour really doesn't provide much insight into the reliability situation. I don't feel like I sufficiently answered that question. Probably something that we should address further later.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I just think about from an LSE's perspective, if you're now saying, hey, we're recommending going from 15% reserve margin to 20% reserve margin, that's a lot of procurement. And if we're basing that PRM, again, off the gross peak, when what we really care about is net peak, a key thing that's jumped out to us is to say, is this way that we're calculating the reserve margin like we always used to do it? Is that still the appropriate way to do it? It certainly leads to, I think, like you said, plenty of resources within the net peak and the gross peak. It keeps us reliable, but is it potentially too much? And is there maybe a different approach in a scenario where the hours of concern are the net peak, but the PRM calculation is done at the gross peak? And maybe we need to think about changing that. We'll think about that more in our comments, but I certainly appreciate your feedback.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Any more raised hands?
Looks like there's a question in the chat, Donald.
Yeah, the PRMs should be relatively static, and yes, they should be applied for 2023. The ELCC values may not be, and that's why I'm going to talk about those in a moment.
Yep, so you could use the PRM, but you need to have the different ELCC for the different portfolio.
Mm-hmm. So, great segue into moving forward. This one I think is you. See it star.
Okay, yep. So just kind of a summary of the effective capacity by month by technology. So our first step, as we mentioned before, is to calculate the portfolio effective capacity. So we see the January value that the entire non-dispatchable energy limited portfolio provides, 15 to 17 gigawatts capacity during the summer. But in the winter months, because of the just natural load shape in those months and the renewable shapes in those months, that it provides less capacity value. So we do those first in, last in calculations, do the allocation via the modified delta method to get to the technology specific values. And you can see that solar has very little value in the winter months, higher value in the summer months. Storage has lower value in the winter months as well, kind of the shape of the net load and the ability of solar to keep it fully charged and so forth. Again, that synergy is going to show up there. Storage has lower value in the winter months, highest value in the summer months. Wind has higher value in the winter months and lower value in the summer months. As Donald mentioned, now if you want to go ahead and jump to the next slide. Some of the updates that have been performed, you do see kind of visually that the wind Eocc values are lower in the summer months than they have been historically. I think we'll show that in more detail in the next slide. Due to capturing some of the better production value during those extreme temperature events in the summer. So on this slide, you can see the current wind versus the base wind. What's currently getting applied to wind is higher in most of those summer months. So reflecting the lower output during the extreme conditions reduced the wind Eocc, even though now we have a higher energy limited portfolio and non-dispatchable portfolio, which is going to push that net load peak out into later in the day where you do have higher wind output. Still on balance, our wind Eoccs are modestly lower in those summer months.
I will point out that part of this difference is the way that we allocate diversity. The values, what we call current solar and current wind, came from a study performed in 2019 where we allocated diversity kind of on that prorated megawatt capacity weighted value, not with the delta method that Kevin used here, so or that we used here. So part of that is just the difference in the diversity calculation, and I think that just the evener or the more rounded off curves in these new base values are more accurate, or at least more in line with outcome, more in line with what we think the right outcome is. So they're less erratic.
Yeah, thanks, Donald. Good observation. The solar is lower than the previous estimate of solar values, and that's primarily due to the behind the meter solar portfolio increase from the last study to this one. So the solar contribution, since it's done after that behind the meter solar, ends up being lower. So peak summer months, or the average Eocc values, are in the 15% range. Next slide.
Yeah, that looks like one for me. So these
I probably should have mentioned the storage. Can you jump back a couple of slides? So on 29.
Yeah, we're on 29. So yeah, the storage value topping out at about 80% there.
Yep. So this does reflect as Donald pointed out, the portfolio size earlier, you have this massive storage portfolio. And so the average Eocc, even though the first 10 gigawatts or so we expect to provide close to full capacity value, there's a pretty steep drop off when you get out to, and I think the total storage fleet in this scenario, when you include the storage in the hybrids as well, is between 14 and 16 gigawatts, I think. And we did some some work last summer, part of the MTR, identify the ELCC for the incremental storage, and these values, we are using the last in ELCC from those storage simulations on an annual basis. And so this does reflect the trends that we saw in last year's MTR work. So we do believe that it aligns with that effort last summer. But 80%, given this 14 to 16 gigawatt portfolio of mostly 4-hour battery, you're going to start to see that decline even in the summer months. The hybrid, because there's a different configurations for different facilities. Yeah, sorry, just one final comment. Because there are different configurations for different facilities, the application or the determination of the individual project-specific ELCC could probably be better approximated using the storage for the storage component and the solar for the solar component, adding those together subject to the interconnection size. That's all I've got now.
Okay. You see that, so the base portfolio is one we just talked about, 1 + 3 + 4, and that's about 43,773 megawatts of nameplate in this portfolio. And of course, as I said, the portfolio is the solar, wind, battery storage, pump storage, hydro, and then hybrids. 1 + 3 + 4 means that the base portfolio is all existing, plus 100% of the LSC IRP plans, column 1 and column 3, plus it's that additional capacity selected and resolved. So that's another 4,000 megawatts of batteries. So that represents a very significant amount of new capacity. Scenario 1, scenario A, we have 4 alternate scenarios here. Scenario A is just what if all that happened was the existing. Scenario B includes existing plus half of the LSC IRP plans. Scenario C is existing plus all the LSC IRP plans, but not the additional capacity in resolve. And then scenario D represents the potential 2023, not 2024 portfolio. So you see how we're doing these alternate scenarios here off the base. So the base is the most, is the largest amount of new capacity, and the different, and the other 4 scenarios represent smaller amounts. Trying to see like what's the, as we go from today to 2024 through 2024 into the future, we know we're going to get to levels like this base portfolio eventually. We're going to have to even exceed that if we're going to meet our GHG targets. But but what's some interim values between here and there? And that's what we're trying to get at here. So here's the storage ELCC across the different scenarios. That black line is the storage base, topping out at about 80%. You see how storage A, the scenarios A, B, C, and D. D represents the possible 2023 portfolio. It's kind of that light purple. It's up near the top where storage in September exceeds 95%. So this represents that greater penetration of storage on the system does start to see that pretty significant and pretty dramatic decline in the ELCC of storage on average. So that means after a certain point, the marginal value of storage starts to decline pretty quickly. So you can see, 2023 value is just about the highest one there at that about 95%. You see the different scenarios kind of in between the base and that 2023 amount, showing how penetration affects the ELCC of storage. Hybrids, they all kind of cluster at about the same value. The base number there is just, a little higher, maybe 5 or 6% higher. And that's just because of what Kevin just said about the different hybrid configurations doing different stuff. They're not all exactly the same. So maybe, there's some divergence there, but they're all kind of the same. They're all pretty close to the same values. This next slide is solar. the base solar value here is the highest of any of the scenarios. The different scenarios, solar depends a lot on how much storage there is in the grid in order to use all that solar. So in scenarios that have less storage, solar is lower because the solar doesn't get used quite as much by the storage resources. That's the intuition you're seeing here, that a portfolio that includes a lot of storage is able to use a lot of solar, and so the solar has the highest value in that portfolio. Conversely, wind, well, what do we got here? We got the wind. The base seems to be the highest value for wind. Well, no, the different compositions of the portfolio. What's the lowest one? Wind scenario A. There. Yeah. You see how wind varies across the various scenarios here.
Yeah, no, same idea. When we start to get energy constrained, having that extra energy is more valuable. So you see the higher value in that base scenario that has all that storage in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it moves the peak out towards the evening when you're able to access that higher valued wind, later and later in the evening. Our conclusion, I think we've broadly said most of this already. An ICAP requirement of about 20 to 21% can be applied to all months, and it's consistent with achieving the 0.1 loss of load standard. UCAP counting and the new ELCCs, the PRM requirement can be about 16 or 17% across all 12 months. The significantly larger and different mix of variable and use limited resources in this study yield different ELCC values by technology, particularly different than the 2019 ELCC results that are the currently adopted ELCC values. Large amounts of new storage and modeling of storage constraints reduce storage ELCC. And for the first time here, we're talking about an ELCC value for storage and hybrids explicitly. Interactive and saturation effects across all technologies affect the ELCC values, and the alternative smaller portfolios show the sensitivity of technology-specific ELCCs to portfolio size and portfolio mix. And I think we can break, well, for questions, unless you want to just jump right into these questions we're asking stakeholders, or we can probably just get a few of these ones from the. Okay.
Want to take the hand
Do you want to
first?
do? Yeah, let's take the hands first.
We have Brian Beering.
American Clean Power. Donald, I think we've traded a few emails on this, but I was hoping you could speak to the regional wind issue, specifically ordering paragraph 15 from decision 2106-029 required, regional wind ELCC factors for the 2023 RA year. I think we're getting a little nervous with the timing of that, so I was wondering if you could speak to where we are with that.
We've performed the studies that give us these ELCC values for in-CAISO resources. Based on this setup, the next step would be to we're set up well to begin those studies right, now that we've finished these in-CAISO studies of both the loss of load and PRM and in-CAISO resource values. expect to have conversations with Kevin in the next few days about how to pivot towards the regional ELCC values for wind and how to sort of set up those studies. And we'll, I guess, give you an update at a late, for when those results are going to expect to be put out.
Okay, so would it be safe to say that in terms of timing and, sort of the expectation of having decisions out in June, that we're still on track for that?
So far.
Okay.
We'll give you more information on that at a later time. We'll surface the results when they're available, but we've set it up. We're at a point where we're moving through the process of getting those studies, all the studies required, completed.
All right, thanks. We'll stay tuned.
Thank you.
This is Mark, Concerned Scientist. Can you hear me okay?
You're cutting in and out a little bit.
Oh, okay. Still cutting in and out? Or is it a...
Yeah, a little better.
Okay. Donald and Kevin, thanks. I just had two questions. The first is noting that the loss of load expectation that you calibrated to in different months of the year is different. It's much lower in the spring months than in the summer. Does that affect the ELCC values? I think I've seen some studies that indicated that your calibrated LOLE value does affect ELCC values. Can you comment on that?
You would expect to see some effect of that a really stringent LOLE is going to make, you would expect that storage values would likely be higher and non-dispatchable resources would be lower. So very stringent, you're going to have short, small events. Less stringent, you'll have bigger, longer events. So you would kind of see that relationship work in inverse for storage than for wind and solar. I don't think it, based on the kind of the range, so you see that some months we're at 0.03 and the next month was 0.003. I don't think it's material, but we didn't try to quantify what the difference would be if we had a constant target across all months. Apologies, we don't have additional detail on that, but that's probably as much as I can speak to right now.
Hey, this is Nick Pappas, consultant to the Natural Resources Defense Council. Kevin, Donald, thank you very much for the study. I have a question that's somewhat related to Brian's question, but in the context of storage. So if there were a decision to move ahead with an ELCC application to storage, would the intent be to run ELCC analyses for, let's say, 4-hour, 5-hour, 8-hour, and perhaps some of the other durations that some market participants are pursuing? And can you also describe sort of, is that a barrier? What's the sort of marginal level of effort to do analyses for each new resource class?
So I can speak to that broadly. Donald may have some specific comments to it. We did some work last summer, MTR, looking at different configurations, longer duration, pump storage versus battery. Ultimately, when you're needing to look at these interactions between the technologies for a wide range of portfolios, so as we increase the battery portfolio from a few gigawatts to 15 gigawatts plus, and solar continues to grow, and you're looking at lots of different combinations if you want to test different durations for each of those. Ultimately, there is a heuristic that you can use. You can kind of exhaust the potential for 2-hour battery to supply more than the ratio. So a 2-hour battery right now probably has higher than half of a 4-hour. At some point, it becomes exactly half of a 4-hour battery. And so there's some heuristics that we can do to kind of approximate where we run just 2 axes. We do a storage portfolio increasing, we do a solar portfolio increasing, and then we can approximate if you have different penetrations of 2 and 4 and 6 and 8 hour durations in there, how the overall contribution rolls out. I do think ultimately we're going to need to understand those dynamics, and I think we're looking at various studies to explore that.
Thanks, Kevin. I don't have anything further to add to that. I'd say just my normal caveat of the resources needed to complete more studies like that would be significant, and just be weigh carefully the way when and how we would get that work done. My normal conservative caveat around extra modeling work. So. All right, anybody else on the phone, or can I jump to these chat questions?
No one else on the phone.
Great. So Chris Devon mentioned, I might have answered this question already, storage and hybrids have any LCC values. Some of those values aren't 100%. That means if we are to continue using the current NQC values for particularly storage, which is 100%, that might mean a slight increase in the necessary PRM just because we are, counting one of the constituents of that PRM at a higher level than our ELCC results. So that is correct, the intuition that the PRM would be higher because of that. The base portfolio with resolved megawatts aligns with the MTR procurement in total. It may not, it may be that procurement shows up in 2025 as opposed to 2024, but I think, probably by 2030, we're still at the same values. It's just, I'm not going to say, I will say that the values we put in here in 2024 do correspond to the MTR procurement in 2024. But in terms of MTR procurement, that might be overly precise. I may be wrong about this, but the real metric was what needs to happen by 2030. So it may not be, it may be it may not be ironclad that this stuff happens in 2024, but it will happen. These volumes will happen by 2030. So yes, it does align with the total MTR procurement overall. It is expected, NOAA asks about the different scenarios for the different technology-specific ELCCs. It is expected that the different technology-specific ELCCs will result in the same PRM, and that's because these different ELCC values are meant to normalize the effective capacity contributions of these resources against a reserve margin. So just intuition is that the reserve margin stays the same because we've quantified these other resources. We've quantified the non-firm resources at their ELCC values given their given the penetration in those scenarios. So yeah, the intuition is that the reserve margin stays the same. So yeah. Let's see if I can get any of these quickly. The data that we use here for this study is posted to the PUC website. It's the same data we published in the middle of over the last couple of years. I think the baseline that we have here is the latest baseline that's posted to the PUC website. We have the wind profiles that we updated here are posted to the PUC website, and all the solar and electric demand stuff is posted to that IRP data and assumptions page of the PUC website. I could send the link out. I think it's linked in the document. Noah asks, did you find any limitations of insufficient energy to charge storage resources and how that may have impacted either ELCC or loss of load? Yes, we did. The intuition of what is happening there with batteries, in particular at higher penetration, is that the batteries aren't getting charged all the way. We have two cars going in lanes next to each other. One is solar and one is storage. If the storage gets out where it's catching up to this, if the storage is catching up to the solar, then the storage may not be able to charge all the way. So it's just a relative penetration of use limited resources with storage that affects the average ELCC, and that's because of insufficient ability to charge the batteries all the way. I made a tangled metaphor there.
Right, two storage issues. I mean, one is exhausting the storage. So you fully charged it during the day and then you exhausted it before the need was over. So that one is kind of the primary energy constraint, but we did have some events of insufficient charging. You know, we're testing at even something more stringent than 0.1 here for some of the months. So we are recognizing that, you know, kind of putting the system under stress. So we did identify some events where we didn't have enough energy to charge. That may not show up in actual practice, where if we have this portfolio, as Donald has shown in other work, that the expected reliability of this portfolio, absent removing anything, is going to be 0.006. And so you wouldn't expect charging constraints to be an issue in that scenario. But if we are at 0.1, we do think with that large of a battery portfolio, we do think that there are instances where you can have insufficient energy to charge the storage.
Question here on why do hybrids have a lower ELCC than an equivalent amount of solar and storage calculated separately? Think the ELCC value is applied to its total megawatts. So yeah, I'm gonna have to think harder about that, but I'm not sure that it has a lower ELCC than the equivalent calculated separately, because yeah, I'll have to do some thinking about that.
Yeah, it's a little bit tough to compare because of the configuration of those hybrid facilities, where some of the capacity is larger than the interconnection size, and there's various things that are going on. Ultimately, I would expect, we tested this fairly extensively, you'd expect that the sum of the solar and the storage ELCC should match up those calculated independently, subject to the interconnection size.
Okay, keeping going. Question related to, if you're not able to charge the batteries, is that indicating an overbuilt battery portfolio? Well, not sure I'd say that, but I'd say that the penetration of the relative contribution of solar resources in the system and battery resources in the system is not optimal. You know, the relative penetration of those two is not optimal. So thinking about that a little more, we can probably have targeted those relative levels differently if we were trying to optimize the storage. But you also optimize the ELCC, but you also have things like GHG constraints that you're trying to meet also. That's just a different constraint. Okay, we have question on follow-up on our comments that storage helps other resources get higher ELCC in their base case. Why does storage have a lower ELCC in its base case? The reason that storage has a lower ELCC in the base case is primarily just due to its high penetration. And, you know, like Kevin was saying, first, that it may not be able to charge all the way, but it's also that events might, you know, we might be flattening or whatever. We might have events that sort of last longer than 4 hours. So the duration as well as charging constraint or the inability to charge all the way given available energy are both constraining the average value of storage.
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about it, that the last megawatts of the solar or wind that are added are really restoring the capacity of the storage. So absent that extra wind and solar, the storage would have a lower ELCC. With the storage and with the solar and wind that we have, it kind of restores some of those megawatts, and then we're sharing that value. So the storage is going to get credit for some of that, and the wind and solar are going to get credit for some of that.
We have a question here on the dispatch assumptions of hybrids. Are they limited to charge? Are they limited only to charge on site? Some of them are based on the input. I think, Kevin, did you do you know more about this? So the hybrids are those that are joined together. Is it that hybrids are the ones that have the solar charging restriction?
Yeah, I feel like there was some different configurations in the model that, you know, we had some of them paired behind the interconnection. Some we limited to charge from the on-site renewable, and some we didn't. What we found though is that I'm not sure if this is the question that's being asked, but the on-site renewable, especially for solar, there's generally an adequate energy from the solar so that you don't impair the reliability value of the battery.
Yeah, that depends on how the solar and storage in a hybrid are sized.
Yep.
So that would seem that we're treating hybrids and co-located differently. And the reason we're doing that is because we're just implementing what we got from the IRP plans into the model. And as you see, we made broad categories of resources. The charging restrictions and the interconnection limits got us to treat them specifically in sort of in our model here. But I don't think those kinds of things were the reason why they're treated the way they are in resource adequacy. I'll have to do a little more digging on that question. Thank you for asking it. I'll have to do a little more digging on why resource adequacy treats them the same right now. Check on one more thing before I jump into these questions. Scott, you gave me a quantification of your question that seemed to reflect 100 megawatts of solar and 100 megawatts of batteries. Let's see if that's actually what generally happens in this portfolio. In this portfolio, we seem to generally have at least twice as much. In this base portfolio, we're looking at maybe twice as much solar as we have batteries. And that will mean that an average ELCC for that combination will probably more resemble a 60-ish% or a 70-ish%. Let's see what the actual values turn out to be.
Yeah, Donald, you're right. If you take Scott's numbers there and I use 50 megawatts for the battery portion, I think you're going to end up fairly close. So 150 times 0.3, 50, and 100 times 0.139 is 13, and 50 times 0.8 is 40.
Mm-hmm.
So you're at 50 to 50 megawatts. So they should be fairly close.
Yeah. It's very odd to see a 1-for-1 battery and solar in a hybrid. And a 1-for-1 solar to battery combo is going to lead to, especially if they're charging restrictions, would probably lead to the storage not getting fully charged. So it would have even less ELCC. What we're seeing from these numbers here on this slide is that we generally have about twice as much batteries as we have, about a 2-to-1 solar to battery ratio there, and that's going to help the batteries get charged all the way. So that's important. That ratio is very important when it comes to the ELCC. Okay. Let's see, did I get them all? It's not an implicit assumption. Sergio is pursuing the question. It's not an implicit assumption, but it's from the IRP plans where we source the data that all the IRP plans had that ratio, at about that ratio. So that, when put into the model, gives us the ELCC values that you see. But the IRP plans that we got were about that ratio. And as you see, that's probably the ratio that makes the most sense given the constraints on the system. So given the constraints of how they operate. So. Okay, moving on. We're at 3:25. We'll try to get through this by 4 o'clock. Which portfolios? These are the questions for discussion. These were put into the document. So you've seen them. And we want you to comment on these questions in your comments. So we'll just read through them. Which portfolio scenario, the base A, B, C, or D best represents the likely portfolio in 2024 and 2023 for that matter? Which set of technology ELCC values should be assumed in selecting the short-term average ELCC values? 2, what, if any, changes should be made to the assumptions used to perform the loss of load study? 3, is the loss of load study appropriate to calculate RA obligations for a peak RA capacity framework or a slice-a-day reliability construct? Let's talk about these questions first, and then talk about the second half of these questions on the next slide. Does anyone want to say anything or comment or give their thoughts on any of these questions here? Will give us about 15 minutes to do that, and then we'll jump to the second set of questions for about 15 minutes, and then we'll be at 4 o'clock, and we'll be, that'll be a good target for getting us, bringing us to conclusion.
Hey, this is Mark Specht with the Union of Concerned Scientists again. I actually had my hand up from earlier, but it pertains to the first question. Donald and Kevin, could you say more about what was done to calculate the ELCC values in the alternative portfolios? There was language in the paper that came out that implied that previous work was used, and I just wasn't sure how much of that was new analysis or how much of it was older. Could you just explain that? Thanks.
Yep. So last summer, we performed calculations for the various MTR portfolios, and we developed an entire matrix of solar to storage ELCC. So we have a marginal value for every possible combination of solar and storage. So we took the marginal value at the given portfolio sizes as the last in ELCC and then plug that into the delta method calculation. So we had at the far end of the MTR, the batteries were, the EOCCs were dropping off fairly quickly. So we plug that value into the simulations, and we interpolated precisely the kind of what the portfolio, the various portfolios that we're looking at here, what the ELCC for both solar and storage is in those. Does that answer the question? Thanks, Mark. Are there other questions in the queue? Is there a queue?
They're not.
Anybody have any question or any comments about this deliverability restriction? As the paper says, these values that we present here don't derate any resources based on, energy only versus full capacity deliverability status. What do people think of that? If we were concerned with, if we zeroed out all the energy only resources, you may have as much as 1 or 2% lower PRM, but you would still have the same resources. It would just be an accounting situation at the end, in the Eocc calculation. But what do people think about question number 5 there?
Yeah, so Donald, just adding some flavor here. We wrestle with this in other jurisdictions as well, whether or not you need to reflect that in the modeling too, that an energy only resource, maybe it has some profile of deliverability that reflects some risk in extreme scenarios or so forth. So would you actually simulate with an adjusted distribution of deliverability, or would you still assume the profiles that we have in there for the energy only resources? If you're doing it on the accounting side, you'd want to have alignment with what you're doing on the modeling side if you want to not change the PRM.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Well, does anyone have any insight or comment on these questions here, or should we just wait till we see your written filed comments? Okay. There's 202. All right, Mark, and go ahead.
Thanks. This is Mark with UCS again. Donald, I just wanted to ask actually if you had thoughts on, I think it was question number 2 on the previous slide, how ELCC, you or Kevin, if you have thoughts on how, question number 3, how this fits in to the possible frameworks that are being considered. If you have any comments on that, it'd be great to hear.
This may be, I'll obviously start, and if anyone on the RA team wants to jump in, they're free to do so. I think that personally, I think a loss load study is definitely appropriate to calculate RA obligations. I think the debate is whether an ELCC study is appropriate under both of these flavors of RA reform. I think that this particular loss of load framework does help us set RA obligations for the times of the day that are most at stress. So I would say that this is appropriate to calculate. You know, this framework would be appropriate to calculate the RA obligations. That would be, you know, I have an answer to it. What do you know, does anyone else want to give their answer to it? Or does, obviously, the proceeding and the eventual decision will be made. So.
No, I'll just say, I think my skepticism on the slice of day approach, I mentioned that earlier, just that as we move toward an environment where we are energy constrained, that doesn't give you insight into the reliability concerns, that what happens earlier in the day affects what happens now. So having X reserves at some portion of the day may not be adequate, because we may need a very different if we take into account the energy constraints. So I'm partial to the LOLE study, identify the planning reserve margin, use Eocc, because it's going to pick up all those, the energy constraints, the capacity constraints, the temporal aspects of shifting the timing of the events and so forth. And from a communication standpoint, having a relatively static PRM and then the declining ELCCs as the portfolio grows makes the most sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the thoughts there.
Well, move into the second set of questions. See if I can actually get there. There they are. Do you, question number 8 there, do we have, you know, is an Elcc methodology appropriate for storage and hybrid resources? And is it appropriate to use the storage constraints that we included here, the outage rate and the discharge targets? In particular, number 8 there seems interesting to me. I wonder what people have to say about that. But if people have questions about any of these other, or any comments about any of these other questions as well, this is the time. I'd be happy to hear them so that we can, you know, benefit people for the purposes of writing their comments. I hear that Sergio has raised his hand.
Hello?
Hello, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So this is Sergio Dueñas with the California Energy Storage Alliance. So overall, we have been expressing this across the RA proceeding, and we do consider that storage and hybrid resources can be better represented, particularly now under slice of day reform through other methodologies rather than the Elcc methodology. And this is mainly because of 2 reasons. So the first one really has to do with the ability of the metric to give us assurances regarding the output or the capability of those systems at different hours, right? This is particularly important for hybrids, I would say, but it also applies to storage. An ELCC methodology really doesn't tell you how much you can count on an asset in a specific hour. At this level, even it's the more granular result we get is still monthly. And while it is assuming that it's targeting the hours with loss of load expectation, it doesn't really reveal some of the interactions, particularly during the net peak, that we think the slice of day framework is actually trying to uncover, right? The reliability need in those hours and how different resources can stack up with their expected output to meet that general load shape. So the first part has to do with representing the assets. The second part has also to do more with the financial realities of resources that are expected to come online very quickly and very at a very accelerated rate in the coming years. So I think something that we've seen in this study compared to the 2019 one, I believe that you mentioned earlier today, is that the values have changed dramatically, and those values can also change in a manner that might not be quite predictable. In some months, they increased, in other months, they've decreased. And RA being such a key source of revenue is fundamental for financing these projects and ensure that these projects can actually come online. So in this situation, because of these two reasons, of it's a very substantial variance and its inability to capture the performance in an hourly fashion, we don't think that storage and hybrids should be valued using Elcc. We do expect that the Commission, when in reviewing the report of the RA workshops, they see the discussion that parties have had, and that they use that to inform their decisions on the future of the RA framework, and don't prescribe the solution of how to count storage based on this methodology and this analysis.
Well, thank you for that. We have a question on chat. It says, what's the relationship between muscle load, RA allegations, and implications for RA prices? I guess I'd just say that as RA relative to demand, as supply becomes scarcer relative to demand, it's probably creating market power for incumbent players. And so we may have RA prices escalate as demand for RA increases relative to supply. And I think is how I'd say that. But likewise, we're expecting quite a lot of new resource adequacy to come online in the next few years. So we'll see what happens on that. Anybody else have any other questions? Okay. Last call for questions or comments or anything anybody wants to say. Another couple minutes for that. Otherwise, we may be ready to move on to next steps. All right, well, as to next steps, can I ask the resource adequacy team what the timeline is as far as written comments? Are they formal? Are we filing them just to the service list? What's the sort of mechanism for that? I don't know. So
They are formal comments in the new proceeding R2110-002. They're due on March 14th.
excellent.
Okay. I think We have one more question, actually.
This is Mariam from Energy Division. Since we're talking about the comments on the DRQC methodology interim report filed by the CEC is also due at the same time. And since one of the proposals in that report talks about using LOLE for the purposes of DRQC methodology, I would like to invite people to parties to comment having this presentation in mind when they're commenting on that proposal, whether it does or does not make sense to adopt it. Thinking about the LOLE proposal that was presented today and how it fits into that existing proposal proposed by CLICA. Thank you.
Okay, anything else? All right then. Simone, Jamie, do you want to say anything final before we conclude?
No, I think we're all set, Donald.
Excellent. Why don't you all have a great afternoon and a great weekend. And I look forward to your comments. I appreciate all your time on this Thursday afternoon. And thank you for all your participation in the proceeding. Everybody have a great weekend, and look forward to reading your comments.